Welcome to the Changing Senses of Place, Navigating Global Challenges book launch. My name is Professor Christopher Raymond and I'm your facilitator today. I'm also the lead editor of this book. First of all, I'd like to welcome my fellow editors and panel members to the stage. First of all, Professor Lynn Manzel, Dr. Dan Williams, Professor Andres Damaso, and Dr. Timo von Werth. Welcome. So today we're going to have a brief presentation setting the scene to why changing senses of place in the face of global challenges. We'll then have some questions posed to audience, to pose to the editors in relation to the key messages of the book. Then we'll move to questions from the audience and some conclusions and next steps. During my presentation today, or during the Q&A with the editors, we welcome you to add your questions to the Presimo link, which is featured on the screen right now. So please copy down this address and send your questions there. One of my colleagues will collate the questions and then send them to me on the stage where I can ask them directly of the editors. So setting the scene, why changing senses of place in the face of global challenges? This book deals with the big question of how do we navigate the contested forces of stability and change in a world influenced by multiple interconnected global challenges. We all are seeking some stability in the world through family and friends, through different forms of home connection. But at the same time, we're facing a rapidity in global challenges, including pandemics, climate change and ecological regime shifts, including more frequent and intense bushfires. And as shown last week, we have raging bushfires across the northwest of the US, as well as through to Canada. Coral reef bleaching, as shown in the Great Barrier Reef here in Australia. New forms of migration and belonging, rapid movements of people, as shown through Europe or through Asia and Africa, but also rising tensions, such as what we've just seen recently in Afghanistan. We also have rapid transitions to renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, but also increasingly opposition to these developments, particularly by those who live close by. And of course, competing territorial claims, as shown by the ongoing conflicts between with the Palestinians, with Israel, etc. But we're also facing different forms of urban change. In some areas of the world, we're facing rapid gentrification, changing of areas to suit certain commodified needs, but also leading to new forms of displacement and new forms of people living in the streets. And who can forget the technological and legal transformations we're now facing, pervading our banking systems, our geo-tracking systems, the way we engage with green spaces and with each other, and of course Zoom and a range of other technologies which make communications during the pandemic very different than what they otherwise would be. And finally, we're facing new forms of design and urban planning strategies, as highlighted by this increasing focus on active urban experimentation, such as through nature-based solutions. And you can find out more about this through the Urban Nature Atlas, which I've highlighted here. So these challenges show that our concepts of place need to change or be conceptually revisited, given that our experiences of places are changing. So in this book, the main argument is that we encourage scholars to rethink how to theorise and conceptualise changes in senses of place in the face of global challenges that are rapidly moving ecosystem thresholds and altering the social fabric of global societies. So let's go back to where it all began in place scholarship. It came out of this humanistic subfield of geography back in the 1970s, where people like Reef, Chuan and others offered a way of highlighting the essential nature of place. Early writings talk about place as a centre of being, and then they moved into other conceptual areas, such as place as a locus of attachment, as highlighted in the place attachment concept, or place as a centre of meaning, as highlighted in the place meaning concept. Within this essentialist tradition, there are some key characteristics. Place is assumed to be bounded, localised, fixed, and subjectively experienced. For example, the longer a person lives in a given place, the more attached to that place, assumes a level of bounding. Also, place is assumed to be insular and stable in the context of insiderness versus outsiderness, etc. Place has authentic qualities. This place has certain cultural qualities or certain physical qualities that cannot be found anywhere else. And this type of understanding of place has been promoted within disciplines like architecture, planning, and related fields. Moving forward 30 years, we're now confronting new meta-theories, such as a systemic perspective of sense of place, which has pushed a sense of place towards a more progressive or relational approach, where place is not a fixed entity, but produced through flows and mobilities in addition to power relations. We're also grappling with the influence of systems thinking spanning the natural and social sciences, including social ecological systems perspectives. So how do we better understand the interrelationship between changing senses and changing places? First of all, we need to understand what are senses and what are changing places. In the book, we define senses as the myriad of ways in which people understand, interpret, and interface with the world, involving multiple sensibilities, physical senses, and embodied identities. By sensibilities, we refer to the ability to perceive stimuli, mental or emotional responsiveness. By physical senses, we refer to touch, sight, hearing, smell, and taste. And by embodied identities, we're referring to a deeper understanding of body awareness through mindfulness, meditation, and the concept of presence. Changing places refers to the new patterns of social spatial relations and experiences of placeness that surface or are resignified, rescaled, or revalued. From this, senses of place refers to the plurality of place-related meanings, interpretations, and values that are constantly produced, contested, negotiated, reconstructed, and embodied by individuals and among collectives of people in relation to changing physical, social, political, and ideational environments. These dynamic people-locational bonds are nested or embedded in other places of smaller or larger scales and are contextualised with reference to different time-space relations. There's a lot in this definition, and I'll be unpacking this in relation to some core principles shortly. But there are some cautionary notes to this definition. We're not supposing a singular characteristic of any place. A place can take on multiple physical or social, and indeed personal characteristics. We're neither nostalgic or romantic about an unchanging past in our treatment of change, in that we need to navigate both fixity and fluidity in people-place relations and people-place connections. And thus we embrace an epistemic attitude that is sensitive to knowledge co-production, and we recognise the various and rapidly changing panorama of place experiences in today's world. Why senses of place? Well, as we showed earlier, global challenges and transformations have greatly accelerated, intensified, and expanded, which leads to new forms of fluidity and makes senses of place even more salient. It's a powerful lens to translate large and complex global challenges into multiple consequences relevant for local communities. And it reminds us that scholarship on people-place relations is much more variable, contested, and fluid than is often recognised. So coming to some of the principles. So there are 25 chapters in the book, and it's not possible for me to relate every chapter to the principles I present here. So I'm going to present some examples of chapters with the view to my fellow editors outlining some other examples linked to chapters later. First of all, senses of place operate as boundary objects, meaning that they deal with they are a way to connect place contestation and different temporal and geographic scales of people-place relationships. That's highlighted by Murphy and Williams, who show how climate change adaptation needs to transcend a static place-focused approach to examine different temporal dimensions, for example, past, present, future, rhythm, and speed. The second principle is that senses of place reflect multiple layers of place contestation. The global challenges can magnify and intensify disputes between different place interpretations and mobilise a plurality of altered place meanings. For example, Stedman and Nielsen highlight through new forms of renewable energy in upstate New York, how that there are different meaning-making frames regarding these new forms of technology, leading to political tensions. Galibla in the Middle East highlight how senses of place can merge through emotionally ambivalent bonds with place. People can have positive, negative, and ambivalent bonds happening at the same time in the face of conflict. And Manzo and DeSanto talk about the competing discourses regarding urban development in Seattle. Third principle is that senses of place can be rechanneled through globalisation and technological and legal transformation. For example, Chong and Chow showed that IKEA catalogues in China have led to some form of cultural odourlessness, in that in these catalogues there's an absence of national traits in cultural products like furniture, leading to that odourlessness and changing one's senses of place. Also, through the examples of technological transformation, Ed Ralph talked about the fact that sense of place has plural aspects. Some are rooted, others are malleable. And those that are more malleable relate to the personal, e.g. memories, experiences, the social, knowing about being somewhere, and public, ideological dimensions. But some other areas that are more fixed include the ontological dimensions of place. In the context of legal transformation, Castro and others talked about how new laws lead to new constructions of place and also are set into contest as a result of national and international obligations. And Purin and Drews talk about how policy frameworks in South Africa can lead to the expression of multiple senses of place, also linked to this legal transformation. But senses of place does not always lead to a positive effect. There also can be non-belonging, and this is highlighted by Lau et al. In the context of settlements in South Africa, that there is where narratives of belonging and non-belonging are mutually constitutive. And in context of translocality, Alice Herzog showed how senses of place in situations of transnational migration cannot be understood in isolation of the place origin, which he refers to as an extroverted sense of place. One other principle is that senses of place help us understand the assemblages between social, ecological, and technological systems. For example, Baroda et al. Showed that there is a constellation of subjective, social, spatial, technological, and political elements of place among victims recovering from natural disaster in Chile. And Divine Right and Wisma showed how, through reflections on renewable energy developments in the UK, that the acceptability of these developments depends upon how the technology is interpreted symbolically, what they refer to as the place technology fit. And Olafson et al. Reveal how different senses of place emerge from the couplings between social, ecological, and technological systems, as highlighted through the conceptual figure on the right. And finally, senses of place promote post-normal science grounded in epistemic pluralism. By that I mean we're heading towards a more flexible, reflexive, and responsive way of understanding senses of place. in that senses of place is multi-layered. It requires a transdisciplinary approach, like multiple forms of knowledge and engagement with diverse communities. And we also need to consider the positions of not only the researcher, but also the researched in our understanding of senses of place. Aloika and Debush touch upon this by talking about the fact that place is linked to a multi-layered history, looking at the interface between place continuity and change. And Believer discussed this in the context of contrasting feelings of home, including security and threat, renewal and nostalgia, referring also to that multi-layered conceptualization of place. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd now like to ask some questions of my fellow editors and panel members. So the first question I have is for all editors, but maybe we'll go with Lynn first, followed by Dan, then Andres and Timo. So from your perspective, editors, why does sense of place need to be pluralised and problematized in the context of global challenges just presented? So first of all, Lynn.
Sure, thanks, Chris. Good evening, everyone. Well, before we problematize or talk about pluralizing senses of place, I want to circle back to the kind of definition that you were offering a moment ago on how we're defining the concept in the first place. So in the book, we explain that that senses of place is a constellation of place interpretations, meanings, values, and they're continually formulated and negotiated among collectives of people. And they're developed, this is important, in relation to the socio-physical characteristics of the space itself. So collectively, when we envision this book, we wanted to underscore how much contemporary life is really requiring us to create new connections to place, to think anew about the dynamic ways that we're in place these days. And if the pandemic and other things haven't taught us that, I don't know what does. So the ways that we're connecting to place around us are becoming more diverse, more contested, and more context dependent. So pluralizing and problematizing senses of place, as you've been already outlining, is recognizing the diversity in ways of knowing and ways of relating to the land and living on it. And importantly, I think a singular sense of place, which has been more typical in the literature, is really problematic because it has implicit in it sort of a claim of authenticity, that there's a singular way to characterize place. And that automatically denies multiple ways of knowing and relating to place. So for environmental managers and decision makers, for planners and designers, landscape architects, then that singular approach to sense of place is really a slippery slope, because it then starts to mislead us into thinking there's one right way to design, or that a sensitive design could magically uncover the sense of place. But we know that sense of place is much more complex than that. And it's not a characteristic of place that belongs out there to the place itself, devoid of people and interpreters. So it's not a characteristic of place in some objective sense. And that's what we were trying to do in the book by problematizing and pluralizing senses of place.
Thanks very much, Lynn, for that response. I'll now move to Dan. What's your response to that question, Dan?
Well, first of all, thanks, Chris. I thought you summarized it well, and it's going to be hard to build a whole lot on what Lynn just said. I guess I've always started with the idea of pluralism, that I kind of take a philosophy of science angle to it. You alluded to some of the philosophical issues in science in your presentation. To me, there's just this unrelenting diversity in how sense of place has been understood across many disciplines, going back almost 50 years now. And so to deal with this thing, there's sometimes a tendency in science to try to push our understanding to some common core set of understandings. And I think the pluralism idea sort of argues against that and says that we should have some sort of a epistemological humility, this idea of post-normal science, where we accept that there's going to be divergent and different understandings, and we can actually profit from those different understandings by investigating them in comparison. And I think this is particularly important when we're dealing with an increasingly complex, dynamic social ecological system where it can be very hard to sort of narrow our understanding around one common conception. I think you also talked a little bit about this in your presentation. On the sort of problematized side, and yeah, this has come up kind of throughout, is this idea that we're challenging earlier notions of sense of place as really fixed and deeply rooted in one location, a home or a neighborhood or a community. And instead, talking about this idea of kind of the fluidity and complexity of places and how they sort of are assembled from different kinds of features, from the materiality of the place, how we represent them in language and so forth, and then how they're embodied in both our social and our institutional practices. So as we face these global challenges, we're sort of pulling at the roots of this fixed notion of place and revealing that people aren't always attached in that kind of singular rooted way. And in fact, for many people, those singular roots were already problematic, leaving to them being excluded in some way. So the challenge of the 21st century, in a sense, is to more explicitly acknowledge how our strategies and relationships to the world are fundamentally implaced, and kind of the lived experience of that emplacement.
Thanks, Dan, for that response. Andres, how would you reply to that question?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and good afternoon to everyone. It's going to be difficult to add something new to what my colleagues just said, because we actually thought about this book collectively. But I think that adding to what Lynn and Dan already said, especially what Dan said about new ways of defining places, I believe that when we started to think about writing this book, we were interested also in stretching, in enriching, in widening the conceptual meaning of sense of place. It was kind of the objective also to rework at the conceptual level the idea of sense of place, as it has been treated in most of the theories about place so far in the academic literature. And I would say not only in the essentialist tradition that, Chris, you were mentioning, but also in later traditions. So what we see is that in the social sciences, as my colleagues just said, dedicated to explore sense of place, broadly speaking, there has been a tendency to understand this experience of place as being something that is spatially bounded, and then sort of the sense of home, something that is fixed like the home, or the neighborhood or other scales, as something that is, and this is important, we think, basically stable over time, leading to an experience of mainly rootedness, but we could talk about also attachment, which is a concept that was already mentioned here, identity, belonging, really modern, solid concepts. And also the tradition of understanding senses of place or sense of place as a unitary and coherent experience, overlooking ambivalence, contradiction, negative experiences. So the world is kind of full of negative experiences, but somehow a sense of place are positive. How come is this possible? And also as something that takes for granted in the line of the philosophy of a place that Dan was just talking about, that people and places are essentially separated entities that interact at some point, but that can be thought of separately. So we're trying also to challenge this. And I think that contemporary global challenges, such as the ones that are tackled in our book, you talked about this, Chris, gentrification, nationalism, digital or virtual spaces, and so on, they fundamentally raise the need to redefine, to rethink the definition of senses of place as a conceptual tool in a way that can not exclude modern or essentialist views, but encompass, change, instability, mobility, ambivalence, contradictions, those still, we believe, hidden facets of sense of place. So this is why I believe that pluralizing and problematizing sense of place could be the two cross-cutting themes of the book.
Thanks so much, Andres. And Timo, what's your reply to that question?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and good afternoon also from my side. It's indeed difficult to add to what my fellow editors already mentioned, but I'm putting focus again on the global challenges, the context of this book, and I want to emphasize the accelerating dynamics that we observe with many of these global challenges that we cover in the book. The acceleration of climate change dynamics, the further intensifying urbanization in large parts of the world, and these dynamics, they literally take place, right? And they may disrupt or reshape existing people-place relations. And that was, for us, or at least for me, one of the starting points for this book. And I think with this book, we then argue, first of all, that taking a place-based perspective on these global challenges and on the necessary or to be expected transformations, deep transformations, that this offers new insights about, for example, adaptive responses, and that it hopefully allows for new ways of reflecting about just and more sustainable, so to say, imaginaries for the places we live in. And with this attempt to pluralize the concept towards senses of place, we aim to acknowledge the diverse and rapidly changing place experiences in this context of accelerating global challenges. And I see this pluralist conception of senses of place in the book, I would say as an appropriate fit, because the rapid changes to our social and environmental conditions, they lead both, as Chris, as you mentioned earlier, to changing senses and changing places, and recognizing and taking seriously that multiplicity of dynamic senses of place. I would say that then offers us really a promising way forward to translate the large and complex global challenges into the consequences and concrete implications relevant, for example, also to local communities. I think that's one of the key rationales why engaging with the pluralization towards senses of place in this book.
Thank you for those responses. So we had a range of responses there looking at aspects of temporality, of post-normal science, of looking at different layers of place problematization from Lynn, and then we had the transformation aspects from Timo. Thank you very much. My next question is to Lynn. Lynn, this is a multi-layered question, so let's separate it into two. First of all, how do senses of place challenge our ontological security, and what do we mean by this?
Thanks, Chris. I really like this question because it lies at the heart of why we wrote the book in the first place, right? So I think to begin answering that, I want to clarify what we're talking about when we say ontological security, and to emphasize how vital place is to that. I think, I particularly like Anthony Giddens' a way of describing this idea of ontological security, and a piece he wrote back in 1990 that I'm quite fond of. And he says, and I quote, "This is the confidence that most humans have in the continuity of their self-identity and in the constancy of their social and material environments," end quote. And that latter part in particular really intrigues me, and I think we're trying to address in particular in the book this idea of the constancy of our social and material environments. So this idea of ontological security is really about helping us cope with a fundamental existential anxiety that we're facing. It's about a sense of safety and security, and trying to understand that when we wake up in the morning, some semblance of life as we know it might still be there. And so this idea of ontological security, I think it's also well described by a scholar, Jennifer Mitson, and she aptly calls it a firewall against chaos. I quite like that phrase as well. So now, with this increased environmental volatility we're experiencing, social change, upheaval, place change, we're really starting to appreciate that our sense of ontological security can't be taken for granted. And so that's a core concept of the book. We're asking, how can we navigate the contested forces of stability and change, like you mentioned earlier, Chris, in this world that's sort of facing all these interconnected, complex challenges. So we take the concept of senses of place and posit that that's the crucial sort of the linchpin in understanding how to navigate all this change and uncertainty. So if I'm hearing the question right, it's not so much that senses of place is what challenges our ontological security, but it's changes to the place, environmental risk, or what I like to call sociospatial precarity. That's what's challenging our sense of security, our sense of stability. So we have to recognize that our expectations for this continuity, the stability in our habitats, in our lifestyles is just, it's sort of on the table for just massive, unprecedented change. And we're realizing now that the management and governance systems that we're still using were designed for 20th century problem solving, and they just don't serve us well anymore. So how now do we address all these challenges we're facing? And we're positing that the construct of senses of place is a key way forward in how to handle this precarity.
Thanks, Lynn. So maybe the solution side of that is the question, how do we design strategies to build one's resilience to cope with changing senses of place?
Resilience. So many of us in all disciplines now, but especially in the environmental and the place-based disciplines, are really grappling with resistance. So it's been a hot topic for some years now, and I think still getting even more so. But that's important. But in order to address this issue of a resilience, we have to be clear that it's not about returning to some pre-disruption normal. That's how we were thinking about it originally in the discourse, right? But instead now it's about how to respond to change, and of course, place change in particular, in ways that foster coping and not only help us to survive, but to do well and to actually thrive. And we need to understand how to do this on both the individual and the communal level. And once we open it up to thinking about resilience, not from like a pure psychological standpoint of intrapsychic, thoughts and, reactions and emotions, but when we start to think about this idea of resilience on a community level, then we're also opening up issues of uneven landscapes of power and equity issues. But we're maintaining that paying attention to senses of place is really the essential ingredient in building that ability to cope with change. So I might seem like a stickler for definitions, but going back to that definition of senses of place as this constellation of meanings and interpretations and place values, that's really critical to thinking about coping, because it reminds us that place is not a static backdrop, that it's an active agent of meaning making in our lives. And that's really important. So we need to understand all these psychological and social implications of the way that we relate to place to be able to respond to this change. So the very idea of resilience, at least in my view, is a pivotal one in this area, because we've got to think about how do I put this? how we can change, use change, optimize change to build a new and less destructive normal. So these challenges and changes that we're experiencing are a key opportunity to pivot and to create a better, more equitable and just future. I'm very fond of the author Rebecca Solnit, and I like the way she argues about uncertainty as a place of spaciousness. And she says, in the spaciousness of uncertainty, there's room to act. And that's what senses of place and resilience are so important.
Thank you, Lynn, for that detailed response. Before I go on to Dan, I just want to remind everyone that there's opportunity to send me and the panel members questions. So please add those questions to Presimo through the link that is at the bottom of your screen. So Dan, in the book we provide various examples of how people navigate changing places. Can you summarize some of these navigation routes and what it means for how we live in the world?
All right, Chris, thanks. I guess, I'd start by building a little bit more off of Lynn. I mean, this spaciousness and how you navigate this spaciousness of uncertainty, to me, is kind of the core thing here, that our lived experience of change has the potential to unsettle, if you will, our sense of place, our identities, our ontological securities. And so as places change, then we look at, well, how do people navigate that change? And in some ways, people have always been navigating change, but we think that, there's this term of the great acceleration, that there's something about all these global challenges that sort of accelerate this process, if you will. So our senses of place are potentially disrupted. The lived experience of our local place is disrupted by change. So the question is, again, how do people navigate within that change? I'll just give you kind of a immediate personal example. So where I grew up, a place called Lake Tahoe, which is kind of in the picture in my background, which is maybe why I chose that picture, has experienced a rather large wildfire this year. And so, here I am thinking about this place in the background behind me that a year ago I took this picture, and now all the stuff on the left side's pretty much been burned up. So I find myself grieving about this change and thinking about how do I deal with this kind of thing? Will it ever be the same? What do I do about it? It's kind of this sense of loss that's associated with some kind of change. But I guess to get back to your question a little bit here, what are the roots of navigating? What are the different sort of ways? How does this manifest itself? And I think part of the way to think about that is to start to think in terms of both kind of the spatial pattern or spatial structure within which we live, multiple places, many places, and also then the temporal patterns that are associated with that. So again, we've talked about this movement from sort of this deeply rooted sense of place to this more fluid conception. Of course, navigating sort of fits this idea of fluidity, of moving through space and over time. And one way that it's not so much in the book, but one way we've talked about visualizing this is the idea that you can think of the landscape out there as kind of an archipelago of islands of meaning, if you will. And you can imagine then people navigating through this archipelago in a boat or something, to kind of create some sort of sense of place out of the collective sets of places in their lives. And in fact, maybe part of the resilience is kind of having, I call it sort of a plan B. If my fired landscape there burns, what is my plan B? What is and to have a plan B, or to have access or even power to have a plan B, then is a kind of resilience. And it's about then building up meaningful relationships to places, both across space, but over time or throughout the life course, if you will. So we see this coming up then in a couple of examples. So one, for example, in a lot of the stuff about the energy transitions and things, a lot of this is about the different sort of nested scales at which people assign meaning to places. And I'll give you kind of a concrete example for how I've experienced this. Is somebody once asked me, how many oil wells would people accept before it changed their local sense of place? Well, the first thought I had was that, hey, it'll only take one if it's right in visual sight of my home or something like that. But if it's off in some distant area, maybe it takes more, you know. So there's this navigating between a very specific local place and then the larger regional scale, and that kind of thinking comes up a lot in some of the energy transitions work. I think, you know, another way that comes up a lot is in the whole area of this translocality, migration, nationalism, and sort of the competing territorial claims, where there are these deep-seated assumptions about who belongs where, and as people move around, that changes this sense of place or attachment or identity. And so some of the work looks a lot at these sorts of connections that people make between, so maybe their original home place, if you will, and their new community, and how they construct a sense of belonging through those kinds of things. For example, somehow maintaining ties to your original home place. Some of this is done transnationally, of course, but some of this is just say within one's own country. And these then become really important ways in which people try to splice together, if you will, these kinds of identities. And a lot of this also contests, I think, and this came up a lot in papers that dealt with Africa, the legacies and histories of colonialism and how those identities then are being challenged. But it's kind of a struggle to challenge those things. And this idea of mobility is, say, much more of a way in which people are navigating through change in various forms of migration, to the point, and I think somebody mentioned this, of even issues like refugee camps or informal settlements, where the one way in which people navigate that is to develop a story about themselves as non-belonging. It's a kind of belonging rather than the absence of belonging, if you will. Let's see, what else do we have in terms of, I think some of the things about the temporal dynamics of navigating come up, particularly in, for example, the context of climate change, where there's this future that's unfolding out in the distance, but it's very hard to know what exactly that future is going to be. And so people negotiate, navigate, or resist these alternative futures for their place as a kind of way of thinking about how do we achieve a future sense of place that's resilient, if you will, to go back to Lynn's point, resilient to climate change, even if we can't control the big global forces. What can we do in our local place to deal with that? Thanks,
Dan. Dan, I've got a question from the audience here, which is highly relevant to what you've just been saying. I'll read it out to you. Do we have any insights or perspectives regarding land use planning in cities, particularly how to address issues of NIMBYism? You talked about the oil fields earlier and the fact that, you know, if you have one oil field next to you, you might have greater resistance than having 5 further away. But could you talk about that or try to address that question in the context of what you've just said?
So the question, just to try to capture it, is how to deal with basically around NIMBYism? Is that?
Yeah. How do you deal with this issue of NIMBYism through this new understanding of senses of place?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say is that conflict and contestation is at the core of all of this. So NIMBYism doesn't, there's no magic way to make it go away, if you will. So I think part of this has always been about how do you sort of democratize access to those kinds of changes that might take place in a local area. And that, basically as a natural resource manager, I'd say it's about open and just collaboration about the future of this place. NIMBYism becomes a challenge if people just sort of insist that that they don't want change. But it's, we also have to understand that because of their place identity. I mean, there's a reason for that. So there's no magic bullet here, but I would strive as a manager towards trying to make that those decisions as open and democratic as possible, locally so, and not just nationally so. So, if the national government says thou shalt have, let's say, a new prison in your backyard, do you ever get a say in those kinds of decisions? Having a more open dialogue about those things would be where I guess I'd point the emphasis.
Thanks, Dan. Now the question for Andres. Andres, how do different forms of place contestation and issues of non-belonging and translocality challenge the way we understand senses of place?
Okay. Well, Chris, I think that first we must pay attention to the fact that the kinds of terms that you mentioned, especially non-belonging, and Dan talked about this, and you talked about this at the beginning, translocality, and Dan just used this term when talking about migrants' lives. These terms are not common sense. They are not self-evident, and their meaning is complex, and is complex to explain. And that was one of the aims of the book, trying to explain this in a clear-cut way. So these complex formulations and our will to use them almost like hybrid words, I think that they don't derive from a postmodern wish to complicate things conceptually and sound sophisticated. But I think that it is due to the fact that they actually, or we believe they actually try to capture some underdeveloped facets of sense of place that surface precisely because of the kinds of demands that the different global challenges we're dealing with pose to ontological security, as Lynn explained earlier. So these facets of sense of place that need to be acknowledged and conceptualized in order to better understand how senses of place work nowadays in a highly uncertain world. So it's more like a matter of putting a different name to something that has been hidden so far in the study of the experiences of senses of place. So you specifically asked about place contestation, non-belonging, and translocality. So what do these words actually mean, and why do we need them to have a better understanding of today's senses of place? Well, we would need a whole book to explain this, but what does our book say about this? So I would say, and I will pick up on some things that have been already said. Regarding place contestation, I would say that the very idea of contestation challenges what we've been discussing as placid views of place that are dominant, or harmonic views of place that are dominant, still dominant in the literature and in common sense. So in our book, for instance, Contestation helps us questioning common understandings of home as haven, studies of home, assuming that home is the place for safety, for privacy, for intimacy, for retreat. This almost romanticized idea of home as a site that mainly hosts positive experiences. And instead, the lens of place contestation, we believe that allows not erasing this, but incorporating to the idea of home a less placid view, such as when home becomes a site of daily oppression due to gender violence, or a site of daily overcrowding due to home precarity or socio-spatial precarity, to use the concept that Lynn was indicating earlier, and structural exclusion. So let's take care of home in a different way, and we can contest dominant views on home. And another topic to just draw on different issues we deal with in the book, and that highlights the relevance of place contestation, is, of course, and this is common sense, territorial struggles for national belonging and national legitimacy, which tend in the literature, we believe, to focus on feelings and claims for property of a territory, symbolic property, material property, as if it were only or just a matter of pride or a matter of identity or of attachment toward one's country or community. And this, it is probably a strongly psychologized perspective that tends to neglect how nationalist claims against political control or political advantage, territorial occupation, or even political violence, as we have in one of the chapters of the book, they actually foreground historical conflicts that again portray a less placid view of place. They oppose different cultural constructions of place property. What does it mean to be a country of one's own? And this is a contested topic, or conflicting or competing definitions of the nation. We all know that the nation is more heterogeneous and internally diverse than we tend to assume in relation to a place, or struggles to define the true history of a nation in a way that warrants opposing place strategies. Occupation versus liberation, squatting versus eviction. Why these territorial conflicts? They cannot be grounded in anything else than place contestation. And we have more examples. The book reflects upon urban changes and specifically exclusionary urban regeneration programs that typically present a brand new urban district, for instance, in an optimistic way and featuring representations of positive innovation, economic development. I guess that we're all familiar with these kinds of representation of urban transformations, fostering urban well-being, et cetera, sustainability, and so on. But they are in fact ideologically using a one-sided and unproblematic discourse that tends to overlook that senses of place go further than those representations imply. So what about, for instance, marginalized groups, homeless people that use and attach to certain spaces in the streets for different reasons, or those neighbors who see the place change as threatening and unwelcome and alienating, and so on. So here is, I think, my response for place contestation. But moving to non-belonging, and Dan just said something about this related to one of the chapters. What we argue in the book is that involves challenging another common sense assumption, I would say, according to which the places people relate to, and home, school, the neighborhood, the country, etc., are associated mainly with positive psychological experiences of belonging. And I talked about the home earlier. And one of the chapters of this book, for instance, a question is raised about how to explore senses of place that are not premised on belonging and positive people-place bonds, not implicating a sense of inclusion to the place, but rather how to understand it as a complex, I will use constellation because we are used to this metaphor, such as the archipelago one that Dan just used, of ideas and affects that are dominated by an overall feeling of not belonging to the place, of being excluded from the place, and by negative place experiences, but that actually bond people to those places, that they trigger a sense of placeness. They trigger a sense, and they represent a form of sense of place. So this is the case of, my colleagues already said this, informal settlements, and the case of refugee camps, and again, experiences of oppression that we've been having much of this during the COVID pandemic and the total confinement. What does home represent in this context? And finally, just you said translocality, Chris, and wow, this is the big concept, and I guess maybe Timo can say something about this, but I believe that it mainly problematizes that bounded and enclosed ontology of place we already talked about. But when we refer to translocality, we're connoting the property of being in a state of transit between places. It's the idea of dynamism, of moving between, the idea of in-betweenness. And we like this idea of in-betweenness. It nicely fits the idea of navigation. One navigates in between islands, and then we have the shoals and so on. This idea that something that it is and it is not in a given place at the same time, but it's in both or all of them simultaneously. So if one of the places lacks, then we have a problem with the system of places. For instance, we're not in Helsinki right now, at least most of us, but we somehow are there. I'm speaking from Barcelona. This is clearly tangible, but words and ideas and audiences belong to this translocal network of people. We got used to this with the telework in the pandemic, actually making my space here irrelevant except for the material need of the computer and internet connection. So I think that translocality is an emerging, and to use Timo's words, accelerating place configuration. I think it's more a matter of acceleration, not of lack or presence. And this is obviously the book in the case of digital spaces. Okay, how can we theorize digital spaces as this complex multi-local sites shaping and articulating different and more intensified place experiences. And also, of course, migration again, where home is abroad, but life in the new place and bonds to the new place are at the service of attachments to the homeland. Even place dependence depends on the relationship with a place that is absent territorially, but it's really present socially and symbolically, and all these kinds of configurations that we have many contributions into literature, but they are still probably not that systematic. And we try to reflect this, the idea of translocality in the book in this way.
Thanks, Andres. Andres, you mentioned that translocality, the core element is that it problematizes this bounded notion of place. But I've got a question from the audience here. How do you address non-Western views on senses of place? How are they discovered, especially regarding Indigenous cultures? Can you talk about that in the context of translocality?
Well, I think that post-colonial and decolonial studies are, unavoidable to answer this question. We're talking about how colonial pasts reproduce in the present times in the metropolis. Okay, so we had ancient times, we had colonization and the appropriation of territory and resources and labor force and so on. And then it looks like independence meant freeing these countries, but they actually meant being independent, as some theorists said, respect to the global north. So I think that translocality is a core issue in post-colonial studies, and it reflects the way in which we are still colonizing global south through different means. And I'm particularly interested in how racialized encounters, for instance, in the European metropolis, actually reproduce the ways people were dehumanized, degraded, and exfoliated in their lands of origin. And of course, in terms of indigenous communities, if they refer to themselves as such, because there is a controversy regarding this, it helps us problematizing, I think, a deep-seated assumption about senses of place in the North also, that the one who was first has more territorial entitlements to their territories. That is what we say about migration. So I was here first, and then this means that we have privileged access to our resources and so on, the typical xenophobic narrative. This doesn't work for indigenous communities, does it? We were here first, but I don't mind because I'm the white colonizer. So I think that there is a nice way of approaching this post-colonial realities and the idea of translocality by retracing the power relations that are still going on despite formal independence. I think that would be a quick answer to that. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Andres. And perhaps just to add to that, in the book we talk a lot about this embodied view or relational view of senses of place. And that's also akin to a lot of non-Western views on senses of place that we talk about. So thanks for that question from the audience. Timo, in what ways does sustainability science and policy and practice in support of sustainability transformations need to change to accommodate changing senses of place?
Thanks, Chris, for that question. Let me first of all say I honestly enjoyed listening to Andres' reflection about translocality. I think we're recording this, so I'm very happy to revisit the recording. That was excellent. Well, sustainability science, in terms of the transformative perspective here, well, first of all, I would say, let's first of all say sustainability science and and these scientific fields of sustainability transitions and transformations, they are very broad and very diverse scientific communities, and they build upon very various disciplinary legacies, so to say. So I first of all want to say that I can only speak about some aspects of these communities, while there are obviously many others. But in my view, what I would say is what these communities like sustainability science or transition research have in common is their focus on particularly on the dynamics of coupled human-environment systems. So it's a strong system perspective they're building on, and often paired with a long-term perspective, a long-term focus on system change. And obviously, sustainability science, I would say, has clearly engaged for decades already with many of these global challenges that we're referring to here, often guided by clear normative assumptions about preferred future directions towards more, you could say, sustainable pathways, right? And I would say at the moment, what sustainability science could learn, or where there could be a fruitful exchange with the senses of place, debate, or discourse, is I think sustainability scientists and transition scholars are currently challenged to come up with new frameworks for, I think Lynn mentioned it earlier, we are really in a need for more provisional, adaptive, reflexive ideas of governance. I think that's a really core theme at the moment. And I'm speaking about a notion of governance that's emphasizing the inclusiveness across diverse societal actors here, and that these new ways of governing for transformative actions that they allow for dialogue, and that they allow for negotiation between these different actors and networks, and you could say value systems and interpretations, obviously also of places. There has been recent work from sustainability scholars, which is framed as a new place-based governance, a new place-based sustainability governance. For example, Gulsrud and colleagues, I think we also refer to them in the conclusion section of the book. And I would say it's a pretty interesting avenue of research at the moment, and it emphasizes, for example, the role of more emergent, self-organized learning networks and partnerships across spatial scales in response to the global challenges. And I find it pretty interesting because this resonates with some of the arguments we make here in the book, because senses of place, as we conceptualize it here, it has been said several times before, we see it as contested. I could add, I see it also as multi-layered across scales, transcending spatial scales, and as dynamic. And these aspects, they actually ask for new forms of, you could say, discursive spaces in which we can reflect and in which we can co-produce knowledge together about places. And these changes in senses of place that we refer to here, they obviously occur at different spatial scales, from the intimate to the global, and somehow transcend these scales. Just a quick personal note that always comes to my mind in this context is I spent some time in Australia in 2014 at the Great Barrier Reef, and I still feel a very strong connection to this region and to the reef, interestingly. But I also realize how, over the last 7 years, that connection has changed over time. And it becomes clear. There's also a very interesting chapter in the book on the Great Barrier Reef, and this chapter really illustrates how intense and also how dynamic over time this connection between such a place and people can be, particularly in the context of coral reef collapse, and how place meanings with coral reef collapse over time then adapt, and that from the very local intimate scale to myself sitting in Western Europe and so to say only have an imaginary of the Great Barrier Reef in my mind and emotions connected to it. So to wrap up and get back to, so to say, this nexus of sustainability science and transformative sciences with senses of place. What I think could be an interesting question for future research in sustainability science is definitely, and some of the chapters get to this aspect in their conclusions, how far changes in the senses of place could be harnessed for these new ways of governance of places. And what I mean with this is basically how we could build on or harness these changes in senses of place for public engagement, for new ways of, let's call it, place stewardship efforts, and maybe pushing it a bit further in terms of speaking of maybe some sense of an enabling capacity that might be somehow explorable in senses of place, in changing senses of place over time that we can build upon. And that maybe refers back, sorry for a last comment, to what Lynn earlier mentioned as the spaciousness of uncertainties. Maybe that could, so to say, be complementary to that we find ways on how to unpack such capacities of building upon the diversity of senses of place and harness them for new ways of governance and place stewardship.
Thanks, Timo. And I think I was also going to comment on, link it back to this spaciousness component. How do we actually employ transformative governance approaches to actually use the senses of place content as a space for enabling positive change? And that's a huge area of inquiry in sustainability science at the moment. How do we develop new ways of enacting positive change on the landscape? Timo, I had a question for the audience linked to this issue of grief, and it's nice that you brought up the Reef chapter in the book, where I think it's by our colleagues in Australia, who talked about the changes in place meanings and senses of place in the context of coral reef decline on the Great Barrier Reef. But the question from the audience was, can the panellists comment on how ecological grief may be connected to a mainly Western sense of ownership? I wonder about if one reason we feel pain in place changes is a realisation we cannot and we never truly own a place. This person's asking us to reflect upon Western traditions of control of place. Do you have any reflections on that question and comment, Timo? If not, you can pass it on to others.
Yeah, give me a moment to digest because it has several aspects to it. But I would maybe reiterate what Dan mentioned earlier, that first of all, I think it's relevant what I mentioned earlier to find, so to say, find places that acknowledge and, so to say, respect this grief and so to say, provide platforms that allow to make this public or make this a theme in discourses, and I think that's one way how also transformative science is currently dealing with issues of decline, of loss, of grief in the context of long-term transformation, and which hasn't been touched upon that much because we often tend to focus, so to say, on building up alternative, more sustainable practices or structures, while obviously a fundamental, deep transformation of our human environment systems requires also the loss and decline of a lot of habits, practices, structures as we know them today. And I think finding appropriate ways and forums where this grief can be addressed and so to say can surface is a first step of dealing more transparently and more inclusively with these dynamics of change. I haven't touched upon, so to say, the aspect of if that is more of a Western perspective, but maybe Andres or Dan, you have some ideas on how to complement here.
Or Lynn, yeah.
Or Lynn, of course.
Not at the moment. No, that's a.
Actually, I do want to say something. And this is, as all the others, really thoughtful, complex questions, tough ones. Not being an Indigenous person, there's a limit to how I can appreciate and answer this question, but it's a really important one that's looking at, whether a Western, modern, even capitalist sense of ownership is where grief stems from. And if we look at other, Indigenous worldviews, would that negate even this possibility of grief? So fascinating question. And I'm thinking about colleagues, Indigenous scholars, colleagues and students alike, who do place-based research. And it's, and I'm not so sure that it works quite as simply as that. So even if we don't endorse a Western settler or capitalist idea of land ownership, even in a legalistic or some other kind of materialist sense, doesn't preclude the idea of grief. I've had colleagues studying in the U.S. what's called the Trail of Tears, as Native tribes were forcibly removed from their homelands and forced to march thousands of miles or kilometers west, and people revisit and rewalk that Trail of Tears as a tribute to their ancestors, and tribal allies also attend, and it's very loaded and powerful. So I think it's a really provocative question, and I think there's something in there that we really do need to interrogate the way grief is expressed through common capitalistic understandings of ownership. But at the same time, there's still those bonds to place. There's still this sense of connection to the land in a very deep way. And it doesn't preclude grief altogether, is what I would posit based on what I know from my Indigenous colleagues' research.
Thank you. Thanks, Lynn.
Chris, can I take a short stab at that?
Yes, go for it.
There was a time when I did a small project actually looking at people grieving over the effects of a large storm blowing down big parts of something called the Boundary Waters canoe area. And one of the things that we observed is that people process the grief differently, and people who assigned sort of a natural cause to this change were more able to process the grief than people who sort of anthropomorphized it as somebody did this kind of a thing. And so it just seems to me like there are different pathways or processes for dealing with grief. And I would echo what Lynn and Timo said. We really need to look into these aspects more closely. I don't know, again, this question of how ownership, I kind of going back and inspecting my data in my head in a way, to what extent people felt ownership and how that influenced their processing of grief.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Andres, you have a response for your hand up.
Yeah, very quickly. Sorry, I think this is really stimulating and deals, I think, with power relations. We're kind of touching this issue in an indirect way. I just want to say that we're talking about grief, we're talking about sense of loss, and as a psychologist, I would say that what we need is to treat these categories not as individual private experiences related to place, but as political categories. If we shift towards a more political understanding of how grief works and how is it represented, how is it regulated institutionally, and how it is embedded in broader historical histories of oppression and exclusion, then we can open up different interpretations of people's relationships to places, because sometimes grief, and I'm not saying that this is the case, but it's more kind of, or grief for the loss of place, it's a metonymy for the loss of privilege, for instance. And so we need to be sensitive, really sensitive to explore what is historical relationships to places and what is actually one losing when it is losing one's place. So that was my reflection. So thank you for the question.
Thanks, Andres. So I also have an in-person audience here today, and just perhaps the cue for Larry, if we can have the mobile mic available for any questions from the audience here. So I won't put anyone on the spot, but if you have any questions, please put your hand up and come back to you in a moment. But I've got a few more questions on the screen here from the online audience. This is quite an engaging question. First of all, the audience member wanted to congratulate the team on a fine book. Really happy to see the range of topics, authors, and perspectives engaged in herein. The question is, how do you navigate the myriad perspectives on place change? That is a threat to someone, is an opportunity for someone else. How can we emancipate place from politics as usual, where the place-related concerns of those in power so often carry the day? I'm going to put Dan on the spot first for this. Dan, have you got any views on that question?
Yeah, I'm again trying to process, and I think it goes back to some things that we have been talking about, where this issue of contestation, and Andres developed it a lot. Timo developed it. We talked a little bit about it as the NIMBY kind of syndrome and things like that. And I guess as I try to reflect on that more, I just think that by opening up the discourse about places in more diverse, problematic, plural ways, we're creating at least more intellectual space to recognize that these different contestations come with power relations associated with them. And again, the questions, I guess, to try to turn it into what can we do about this difficult reality, that different people hold different relationships to maybe the same physical space, that I think the sustainability sciences and the kind of thing that Timo was talking about comes back to also trying to innovate in our governance practices. And I can't remember if it was Timo or Lynn or somebody talked about how, maybe it was Lynn, that a lot of how we deal with sort of complex social, ecological, technical change has been built from a governance perspective on sort of 20th century ideas of governance. And we're searching for how to move beyond those things in ways that are more inclusive, do recognize these power relations. And so I guess that's where I start to think about it. It's not something that there's a solution to, but there's a commitment to trying to improve our governance over these contestations.
Thanks, Dan. Timo, there's a lot in this question regarding transformation. That is, how do we emancipate place from politics as usual, where the place-related concerns of those in power so often carry the big day? That implies, how do we actually change issues of who owns place and who actually has a right to talk about place? Have you got any thoughts around how governance approaches could help us rethink that?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. And I'm still having a lot of thoughts in my mind, but first of all, what comes to my mind is also a different role of science. I mean, at least on the panel, we mostly represent basically scientists here, and I think we also make the claim in the book for a more post-normal science way of dealing with senses of place and avenues of transdisciplinary research, because one of the ideas behind these ways of conducting science is obviously a more inclusive way and a co-creative way of creating our knowledges, and that's an endeavor in itself for the sciences, first of all. But that, to me, would be an entry point, and then I could also imagine, well, diverse, as Dan already touched upon, diverse, at least starting points to think about new formats where, so to say, reflection about transformation takes place in a much more inclusive way. Because as we touched upon earlier, participatory planning has been out there for decades. Inclusive notions of urban design have been out there for decades, but obviously those haven't been able now to deal with these complexities, and we still have diverse, overlooked, marginalized, pushed aside groups that are not participating in and having a voice in transformative processes. So maybe one last point, what I'm thinking of is also that it's not only about thinking about novel ways of creating, so to say, forums or ways of inclusiveness, but I think it's also about looking back what has been there and was, so to say, covered over a longer time. For example, already 20 years ago, there was an idea for landscape observatories as a new form of a, so to say, constant, participatory forum that takes a closer and more regular, continuous look on changes in landscape on a regional scale. It's actually one of the demands in the European Landscape Convention from 2001. So it's exactly 20 years, and it hasn't been implemented at all, you could say. I mean, that's the very short version. You could unpack this a bit, but so there have been very interesting ideas, and I think it's relevant to maybe also revisit some of them and see and maybe think about ways of how to shield and protect them from, so to say, the power forces that are out there, and find niches in how they may flourish and get a legitimate influence on these transformative dynamics.
I think implied in that, though, Timo, is not only aspects of environmental justice, but also aspects of ecological justice. So how do we also cater for the needs of the non-human in this in transformative change? Thank you. Look, I'm conscious we've only got 9 minutes to go, and I want to ask the audience here whether there's any question regarding any of the ideas from the book. No, I got... Not now? No? Okay. We'll keep thinking. But there's another important question here, and I deliberately left this one towards the end. In acknowledgement, we did not talk about pandemics directly as a global challenge in the book, because the book started prior to the pandemia. However, we did have a preface or preface on the pandemics. But the question here is, has the experience of COVID influenced your thinking on senses of place in any particular way? And perhaps we'll start with Lynn on that.
Sure, the easy question, right? They've all been very difficult, thoughtful questions, certainly including this. Well, I mean, simply put, the pandemic turned all our lives upside down. So, and I just mentioned it that reality very quickly in passing in the beginning of the session. This is what I had in mind, honestly, when I was saying earlier about how we find ourselves placed anew. We've had, all these challenges, in place, displaced, all the, different, working from home, not, if one's working at all. I think Andres made a great comment before about, well, right now he's in Barcelona, but the material reality of this place, we're also in Helsinki and so on. So the pandemic, I think, really just caused us to confront in a very direct, material, obvious, inescapable way the prevalence of place, the assumptions we make about it in the way we're in place, because it just, all bets were off and everything was just, uncertain. So I think it radically alters the way we conceptualize home, the way we conceptualize belonging, the way we conceptualize safety, radical alterations, which we're going to be dealing with for a long time in the way we manage and understand public space and community, are just a few of the things that come to mind.
Thanks, Lynn. And there's some short reflections from you, Andres, and then Dan.
Yeah, regarding this last question?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just making some notes. I think that the pandemic has shown that first, the unavoidable fact that we are located beings. And then I don't think that we have to emancipate from place in response to the other question, but we need progressive politics of place. Just place, we cannot escape from society, and place is a part of it. So I think that we need to just different forms of governing space. And second, I think that there has been a resignification of home, a refunctionalization of home. It has heightened awareness of what different kinds of and contradictory values attached to home. And related to this, it has rendered more visible social exclusion and social spatial precarity Lynn was talking about earlier. It's not about disruption, but about making visible, as Lynn said, normalized disruptions that were grounded on place. I think that those are my main points regarding this question. Thank you.
Thanks, Anderson. Dan?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It is the case that we were in the midst of writing this book, and the intro and the concluding chapters as a group together, and so we experienced this pandemic kind of together in a way. And I just remember thinking, this is more of a personal thing. It's just that it just so encapsulated what we were talking about, and in that way we had a common sort of framing for talking about the experience of this kind of global challenges and what that means for sense of place and place. And I guess reflecting on what my thoughts were at the time versus now, I felt like there was like this sort of, at a large scale, there was a shared experience of a change. Everybody was experiencing, in some sense, a change, but yet they're all experiencing it in such different ways. And even within our little set of 5 privileged, homebound workers, we all had there were different rules and different ways in which the different national programs were operating and stuff. So it was like kind of like a mini experiment, or mini sort of case analysis, maybe is a better way to talk about it, about what we were doing. So it kind of became for me just sort of a touchstone to kind of help me think about what we're really talking about here as a topic. And I think maybe my optimistic thoughts that there would be something really shared from this, that it's become much more fragmented, I think, than I expected in the end, and much more contested. And so I don't know. It's at least maybe what I would say for the audience is, reflect on your own experiences of the pandemic, and then as another lens to look at the book and say, what is this telling about how we experience places, something we, in a sense, we can all relate to, some aspect of that experience.
Thanks, Dan. And I can attest to the fact that writing this book and the meetings we had was almost a shared counselling experience sometimes, where we shared all our different coping mechanisms and griefs that were occurring along the way. Tim, I want to leave this last question to you. We don't have much time, and it relates to this post-normal science perspective you offered earlier. And if you can keep your answer short, that would be appreciated. So when talking about senses of place from this interdisciplinary perspective, what is the main challenge or main advantage of this interdisciplinary approach?
To keep it very short, I mean, first of all, it's again an excellent question, and we could talk for hours about this. And I would like to refer in the beginning to really, excellent literature on interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary science. There's really excellent work out there. But in a nutshell, my, so to say, comment, more like a comment, would be focus on the shared problem framing in the beginning. So take time in the beginning to really understand the boundaries of what you're looking at and the object of study. And Chris, I think you started actually this afternoon with the notion of boundary objects. And my, not to speak about a recommendation, but I think it's really crucial to actively use this idea of boundary objects in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work. because it's not about transcending disciplines, but it's about finding, so to say, a shared agora or a shared space to learn from each other and so to say, to lift the disciplinary knowledges and epistemics onto, so to say, a shared new level of knowledge creation together. Yeah. And for that, these ideas or assumptions behind the notion of boundary objects are, in my experience, really, really useful. Maybe I'll leave it with this for the moment.
Thank you very much. I think that's a nice way to wrap up the panel discussion. So thank you to our editors and panel members for those enlightening responses. And thank you to the audience for the very engaging questions and very thoughtful questions. I'd now like to briefly return to my slides. Can we get the slides back up? We've had the questions. So the conclusions and next steps. Well, it's hard to conclude all the insights from this discussion, but I want to leave you with two key messages from the book. That any attempt to understand or intervene across global challenges will be deficient if senses of place are ignored. That's a very clear message from the book. And a second clear message is that we need to rethink the way we understand relations through senses of place and develop new capacities to navigate ruptures and new beginnings in not only the places that we experience, but the relationships we form with places over time. And I encourage everyone who's interested in the book to, of course, buy the book. You can buy it from this link here. You can also do a basic Google search on Changing Senses of Place, Cambridge University Press, and it will come up. An e-book, not only a hard book, but an e-book is also available. And finally, in terms of next steps, well, there's many things we could think about, including paper collaborations, workshops, conferences, etc. And I invite people to contact me or fellow editors regarding those opportunities. But something that's more immediate is something that Dr. Tara Quinn, Professor Patrick Devine-Wright and Dr. Vanessa Masterson are organising, which is a seminar series on senses of place and 21st century transitions. It's going to be a monthly keynote conversation starting in September. I'm going to be presenting again in September, but there will be many other place sessions thereafter. So please contact Tara at the email address there should you want more information. So thank you again for your attendance, for your enlightening questions, for the really engaging and interesting discussion. That's it for today. Welcome anyone to contact me or anyone else regarding this book launch, and I wish you a good day or good evening. Bye for now.